Yeah, it looks like we're live. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, yeah. I'm waiting for a little pop-up on my phone now that says status is live. Because usually I get those, except I'm not the person that triggered them.
Yeah.
All right. We can give it a few minutes, one or two, to give people a chance to join. And I think the stream, it looks like it's still preparing.
Yeah. I don't see that from my side. Preparing.
Do you see the presentation already?
Yeah, I do, definitely.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there's also a message that we're live on YouTube and recording. So I think we're good to go.
Okay, cool. Well, if we're good to go, let's go. So welcome everyone. This afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, we are looking to tell you a little bit more about some design projects that we have coming up. Yeah, hoping to give you a bit of a sneak peek as to why we're doing that, what we're planning on doing, and how it would be different from what we've been doing so far. Presenting together with Patrick, if you want to say hi as well. And for sure, we have some people of the design team here as well. So if at any point you have any questions to the design team, please shoot on either Zoom, if you are connected to Zoom, or on YouTube.
Yeah, hi, this is Patrick. Yeah, I'll see if I can check out the YouTube channel as we go along as well to pick up any questions.
Awesome. That would be great, because I'm not sure if I have a good view of that. All right, so some design-driven projects. Why? Basically, a sort of more recent realization that in developing the core application, so status core app, status desktop, so far we've been highly focused on developing good user interfaces. So developing an app like most apps that we experience in day-to-day life. But in doing that, we run into some issues in that our app or our desktop app actually doesn't necessarily behave the way we're used to in our everyday life. For those involved in developing for Web3, that might be known. That might be something you struggle with as well. For us, for sure, it's a challenge to have to work around, oh, right, we don't have people's email address, or we can't ask them to add their phone number. There are definitely a few things that are different, and that kind of resulted in a shift in thinking that what we're doing is not really designing for a UI. What we're doing is designing for a new system. And with that also comes a change in tools, in the tool set that we use. We've been used to delivering mockups. What would a design potentially look like based on existing components that we are known and familiar to. So an example there is the component that we have used in the past to ask people to share data with us so that we can understand how they've been using the app, where we relied on Apple iOS components. So in realizing that we're actually building for a new system, we can't necessarily rely on using those components. We have to go about designing new components and new concepts. So this design project will focus on using a new toolkit to do so, moving away from mocks and moving a little bit more into tools to develop a information architecture, tools to develop slightly different computer interaction patterns. And if you look at the general graph of what is user experience design, you can see that in a way that is all part of it. So if interaction design is at the center of it, we do need to understand people's mental model of, for example, what is an identity, and we need to understand how this can be communicated through certain content elements. We need to understand how it relates to the actual backend of the system that is sometimes blockchain, that is sometimes Whisper. So we need to understand a lot more about the whole sphere around the user interface itself. So a little recap of where we are and where we want to be. Where we are, again, is that we see we have an app that to some extent works really well and feels quite similar to what we're used to in everyday life. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily work the way we're used to in everyday life. And we have found some structural usability issues because of that. That seem to like block essential use cases, like being able to connect with a friend. That works slightly different from, say, WhatsApp, from, say, Telegram, but it is pretty crucial to the success of our application, as in being a communication tool. So listing some of the structural issues there, people still need guidance to add a new contact. Ideally, this is something you can easily do on your own. It's very difficult to understand when you're in a public chat who those other people are that have some funny 3-word username, which is by design, but also creates confusion. So there might be better ways for us to explain what's going on there. Then some of the mechanisms we use to in terms of authentication and verification are slightly different from what we're used to as well. You don't necessarily only send a transaction, but you also sign the transaction. We don't necessarily only authenticate that the user is the user, but we also try and authenticate that status is status, which is why we have a signing phrase or transaction phrase, whatever you want to call it, in place that you should be able to recognize. If you don't, it might be because someone is trying to fish for either your password or altering the address that you're trying to send the transaction to. And then the last point there is that people do oftentimes confuse their own visibility. So are they in a certain point in time or in a chat displayed publicly, or are they being displayed with their chosen username? So in my case, I added a slight complexity because I like my 3-word username so much that I added that as my chosen username, but it adds to the confusion of who am I and who am I talking to? So where we want to be, obviously we want to keep whatever works. A lot of time and effort has gone into the app, and we know certain things work well, and we want to mess with those as least as possible. But what we do want to do is to try and structurally think about what information people might need when they come into the app, or what information they might need over time, which can be widely different from someone who heard about this status thing from a friend, is not known to blockchain, Web3, or any of the terminology, and basically just wants to send a message, versus someone who is a dApp developer, for example, and very experienced in blockchain as a technology. So for each of these people, we would need a different type of information structure to gradually help you understand what's going on. And like in practice, that means, for example, we would want to communicate a certain function like a context code through the label itself, through a hint text of what it might look like, and eventually a tooltip of some sort through which you can dive deeper. And then a final point of where we want to be is that status is intended to be an integrated application. So some people have compared it to WeChat in a way, because it combines communication, transactions, and browsing information. So I really like the concept of being able to select your pizza on the website of a delivery service, being able to make or like use chat to order the pizza and make a transaction at the same time. That back and forth navigation to some extent works well, and to some extent we do see some issues there in shifting between the features that we offer. So that is definitely something that where we want to be, is to have a smooth back and forth navigation, as well as an option to multitask. Oops. All right, so how we plan to get there, and I do realize this is slightly abstract, as we're also still trying to learn and figure out what the best way is to get there. In this whole shift of thinking of we're designing a system, we're not designing just a user interface on an existing platform. We thought about sort of allocating our time into 5 different work packages that in the end we believe will lead to solve some of the issues that we're seeing. A first work package would focus on identity structure and definitions, and we can go more in depth about what we mean with that in a few minutes from now. The second to focus on information architecture, or abbreviated here as IA, and content strategy. A third work package, and then we get to 3 and 4 being a little bit more hands-on design oriented, so more akin to the interface design that we've been doing so far. Home screen and navigation as work package 3, and as work package 4, starting a new chat or inviting friends. We have a final work package, as Patrick and myself are both coming from the research side, which is called formative testing and validation, which in a way is a package that would occur in each of the other work packages. So it's a parallel stream across the board there. All right, so those are the work packages, or the types of work that we believe are necessary to solve some of the issues we have. But then at the same time, we want to limit our scope. And we want to do that because having restraints makes it a lot easier to find a solution that is useful and that would actually solve problems or solve issues that we see with particular users, rather than having something that might work suboptimally for lots of users. So we rather make sure that we have a good solution for a selected group that we can then build on, than a broad solution that may or may work sometimes, sometimes not for all users. So in doing that, we've looked at 2 audiences that we believe would create a healthy tension in terms of the functionality that they might be interested in, and what they are used to based on using other applications at the moment. These 2 audiences are a non-tech audience in the UK. So thinking there specifically a little bit more in the non-tech, either banking or average messenger user, in conjunction with a status community based in Iran. Those 2 specifically because we believe the healthy tension might be in a higher demand for convenience on the one hand, and a higher demand for anonymity and coercion resistance on the other hand. So expected outcome. It's very important for us that this doesn't become a theoretical exercise with a lot of diagrams, but nothing that will end up in a user interface that we can then actually control. The whole intention is to improve the app and the desktop design such that we solve issues. The work packages that we defined as in identity structure and definitions, information architecture, content strategy, are intended to feed that. They're not a purpose or an objective on their own. So the expected outcome here would be a new home screen and navigation design, potentially new terminology and a user interface for some of the identity constructs. So leaving the door a little bit open here, we might move away from calling a wallet address a wallet address or a wallet altogether. A contact code may or may not receive a new name. So all of those things will be reassessed, and that means we might make some changes there. A new location for easy storage and access to context. So while we want to be very careful in sort of compiling context information, we do see that for a big number of users, and then coming back to the non-tech audience UK, for example, is very accustomed to starting with context, and also conceptually as a human being, starting with the people you know how to connect to. In a way, if you have a phone number, it is quite odd these days to then need something else in order to connect with them, which is the case with a contact code. So we want to find a way to leverage the context that people already have. And then the last one is a updated and refreshed profile screen. As we realized that due to our navigation structure and information architecture, we have had difficulties with where do we host certain new features. So we want to reassess that, and that means that the profile screen that, for example, now could hold ENS name, that might move somewhere else, for example. So all of these things are not a given, but are expected outcome of this project. All right, I'll hand over to Patrick, who can talk to some information we have collected around what works and what doesn't work at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Hester. Thank you for the intro. I wanted to dive into this point, or dig a little bit deeper into the point about this point that we have things that actually we've been working on for the last 6, 7, 8 months that we don't necessarily want to throw out, and we also want to ease some fears around what some people might call this is like an app redesign, which is actually not what we're proposing. So we thought it was important to essentially say, okay, well, let's lay some examples out of what is working in the application, meaning like what works by evidence that we see from user studies or user research exercises, where we say, okay, like these are either features or proposed new flows that are successful and are comprehended by people. So to begin with, for example, most recently in Berlin, we tested or user tested chat commands, or a new form of chat commands that you can pop up in chat to send and receive tokens if you would like. And this was well received. I mean, it was in terms of usability, people were successful and thought it was an interesting way of potentially moving your assets around from status to different people that are in your network. Additionally, the seed phrase is more contextual. So what that means is that we're actually satisfied with the decision to move the seed phrase out of onboarding and putting it into places where we think it might be more relevant for people. And the manifestation of this is, of course, is we've moved it into kind of like a warning in wallet now, or within the profile screen after you've first gotten into status, and we've said, okay, basically this is something that doesn't necessarily need to be within the onboarding step, even though it is critical. Thirdly, joining a selected public chat is quite, it's actually quite natural. It seems like it is something that people expect out of a chat application. And getting into that entry point we've seen is pretty easy to comprehend and do for most folks, along with starting a new chat with existing friends. So if so once actually aside from this contact issue that was highlighted, once you have a chat contact, we see that it's easy for people to actually to restart some conversations if they can get back to that chat contact, and that generally feeds into an overall sort of like a sort of positive trend of people being able to interact with private and public chats in a way that we hoped or we had intentionally designed. Making transactions in wallets and with dApps mostly it works. Aside from what we see from like sort of technical issues that crop up in usability studies as well. again, yeah, this seems to be something that people respond to very well, particularly with dApps when they can see that they can make a transaction fairly easily within the status browser. And then we really do actually feel like we've gotten to a point where creating an account and onboarding, in addition just to moving the seed phrase out of it, the entire process, we've actually put a lot of work into it. And we do see higher success rates with completing that process. And then finally, we wanted to highlight that the ENS app, the most recent testing with the ENS app has gone well in terms of people being very receptive to this concept of finally being able to have sort of more of a natural name that they can tie to their account profile and to, or let's say their identity profile in status, which I think we're all familiar with has been sort of a painful or a pain point for a lot of people for a while. So that's what works, and that's what we aim to preserve. We also definitely want to dive into what we would consider to be sort of the key pain points, and really some of the drivers that we've seen from, or like the issues that we've seen from usability studies is driving this effort to put together these work packages, or doing some like a little bit deeper thinking or system thinking around it. So, for example, as Hester mentioned earlier, there's kind of like a lack of guidance of how to contact and add a person once you're on board. And so this is a little bit of a distinction between what I just said around once you have a contact, it's easy to kind of relocate them. This is really more about actually figuring out how to add someone to begin with, and whether that is done through a phone number or through another channel or another means. That's sort of TBD about what the best approach is there, but it's something that we certainly want to take a look at, along with actually just creating this place, this consistent place where people can reaccess where their contacts are. In addition to that, there's this idea that there's kind of misalignment between people's expectations about how contact should be like discovered, or how your own contact information should be discovered and displayed. And this is really more kind of just referring to the idea that, yeah, it's confusing for people to come in and have this anonymous name that they have to both discover is a representation of themselves, and then understand how they change that in order to display a name that they would like to be referred to when they're chatting with someone else, or if they're in a public chat, for example. And then also along with that, there is, I mean, just it generally points to a more broader issue around confusion of new terminology, and how a lot of this terminology that we've introduced, I mean, simply by being like trying to make these components of blockchain technology work, also it's also introduced a kind of some confusing new terms that people either have to understand or get used to over time as they reuse the application. So things like wallet address and contact codes and usernames and display names, these are we see that there might be an opportunity to simplify the amount of terms that people have to work with. And again, maybe the ENS project will help with this, or combine some of these things if that's even possible, or separate them. Along with that, again, kind of digging into this point that Hester talked about earlier about discoverability and navigation. It is true that we've seen consistent examples of people in studies just having a hard time discovering where things are, and especially, say, in the point where you want to add a new contact or invite someone into the application or find a dApp. When we just would like to generally take a look at the overall information structure for how you discover these key properties that we really would love people to discover. But if we have some things that are on kind of like a main navigation tab bar at the bottom of the app, and some things buried below a floating action button, maybe it's time to take a look at whether some of these things should be grouped together or separated. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the final point is, again, around some of the terminology that we use, not just to refer to your identity, but also for, or in terms of security. We see definitely some confusion around knowing what the difference is between things like passwords and seed phrases and phishing guards, which are all there to help protect, of course, your assets and your information. But again, if we're introducing too many terms that people have to get around, then, or concepts that they have to wrap their heads around, then it can be quite confusing and actually pose additional security threats. So this is why we want to take a look at that. The underline here, all the underlined links here are basically pointers to user research artifacts or findings that you can take a look at if you want to take a look at the presentation. If it's not clear, then we hope as well to address these points with these certain work packages. So that's what these notes at the end of each line are. So that's sort of like the overall plan with it. Okay, so I think Hester is going to talk about a little bit more in depth about the details of what the work packages entail, and she'll start off with work package 1.
Cool, yeah, and thank you for mentioning that, Patrick. We will follow up this talk with a discuss post where we can also then share the presentation, including the links to some of the findings we have. So that said, going into work package 1, identity structure, here I would want to reflect on a brief conversation with a core contributor this morning asking, is this the day UXR goes meta? Yes, it is, I think. This all seems to be a little bit more leaning towards computer science than what we are used to coming from design and coming from research. So we've actually talked to some people who are volunteering their time to help us out with this. It's very important for us in order to design an intuitive interface and an intuitive way to connect with other people that we understand the underlying identity structure both technically and that we have a unified language on what this identity means conceptually. So for example, differences between am I my private key, or am I my public key, or am I my ENS username? So what is my core identity, and to what extent do I share this identity, which would not be the case in using a private key, but would be the case in using ENS, or do I share properties of that identity? So for example, a wallet address, or an anonymous username through which you can connect with me, or a contact code. So finding a structure in all these identity elements that we have and how they fit together is something that we want to do in this work package. You can think of that in terms of building an ontology. So in the current web, there exists this thing as a web ontology language. In a way, we see that we do not have that yet for Web3, or at least not to my awareness, specifically when it comes to what is this identity. And in dealing with status having both an aspect of being a communication tool next to transactions, this identity becomes perhaps a bit more of a pressing issue for us to have a unified language on. So what that looks like, very brief, very conceptual, as we definitely need all the help we can get in specifying what this might look like. Think of diagrams, think of, let's say, object or class diagram specifications, mind maps, things like that as an outcome of this deliverable that we can then use as input for example in work package 4, where we look at inviting friends or starting a new chat, where it would translate to what is the information you actually ask from someone in order to connect with them, and what information do you provide to someone when you start a new chat. All right, moving on to work package 2. Patrick, can you speak to that one?
Yeah, so in work package 2, what we aim to do is to more or less extend the work that's going on in work package 1. So it may start at the same time, maybe it's just slightly after work package 1. But what the idea here is that we would like to more or less define the layers of the information within the app, where a user kind of comes to a point where they need to make a decision. We just would like to be clear about what that information should be at that point as it kind of currently sits. and maybe question whether or not there's a better or a more ideal state that that we need to fix for some of these core issues that were outlined earlier. So basically what we're trying to do here is create a map called an information architecture map, where rather than what you might expect out of a design, what you more get in terms of a deliverable is something that looks like a user journey mapped in very kind of in like black and white or gray color, that demonstrates where people come into the application according to potentially what type of user profile they are, and they go through a particular flow in which we want to make sure that we're clear about the different types of words or terminology that we're using for the action that they're taking. So, for example, here, if they're in chat, maybe they want to manage their own or a friend's profile information in chat. Like, how does that work? What paths do they lead down? Where do they go? And what screens do we need to make sure are clear and defined, and that we all have really consensus on as a group that's going to create a final design for this package. So that's what that looks like. Yeah. And then for home screen and navigation, what this work package does is finally really get into the details of what a final, or what might look like a final design, something more akin to like what you would hand off to to a development team that says, okay, like we're ready to develop an application. And in this work package, what we would really like to see in it is just a creation of a lot of different prototypes quickly, rapidly, so that we can kind of ourselves get a feel for the different types of options that we might have for allowing people to navigate within these apps. So building off the layered information structure that's put out in work package 2, without maybe not all the functionality or all like the different elements that you might expect in like a full-fledged application. If you're just testing the navigation, maybe just testing out these flows that people go through, and then documenting the rationale behind it. A good example of what this means more concretely is that Mache, our awesome designer on chat, actually did a very quick exploration of what a bottom navigation might look like in the app. So if you see down there, it's a bit different from what we have now, in that he basically has promoted the dApps in general to the bottom navigation, but at the same time is showing how a user might be able to select different elements and move back and forth between the main properties within the app a little bit more easily. And so what this work package aims to do is see if we can generate a couple of these different types of prototypes, maybe exploring with things like moving the bottom navigation to the top, or finding out different ways for that people might actually want to swipe between the different application structures, and then test those.
I really, just to add on to that, I really like the emphasis on the exploration there. I think one of the reasons we're looking into sort of changing the navigation, or looking into what different information architecture looks like, is because we were able to release an app and get lots of feedback of people already using it at the moment. That's incredibly valuable input for us to finally now take a look at, okay, so what are other ways in which we can allow people to use the multiple features that we have. So very happy with like what's out there again, because if we wouldn't have been able to release, we'd be still stuck in a loop of endless cycles of exploration. I think now that we have something out, this is for us a good time to take a step back and explore all the alternatives that Machu has prepared, that our other designers, Andre and Dennis, have prepared in the past, and revisit them without a strict timeline of having to release, which again has been instrumental to getting feedback in the first place. So work package 4 is similarly very focused on actual UI design and flow design in a bit more of a conventional sense. So designing a flow and several entry points to start a chat with new users of the app. Obviously, it's very important for us to make sure that people who are introduced in the app are not taken aback by all the terminology that they run into, and that it's straightforward to invite then someone else into the app as well. Some of the tools intended to be used there is a pretty textbook design process of starting with use case descriptions, a diagram design for each of these use cases, wireframing, and eventually kind of coloring the drawing to make sure that we do have design specifications to also hand off for development after this process finalizes. So yeah, what it might look like is a little bit more what you would be used to. Perhaps not starting with a flow diagram to specify each use case, but going into wireframes. And then on the right side here, you see an example of a screen that I hope this process of the 5 work packages we're describing will lead to a lot more, as in a combination of layering of information in context with more clarity around some of the identity concepts that we have in place. So for example, here you see in context, as soon as you start a new conversation, an identifier, what are these random names that you can go into to find out more information. So again, this is not something that would then kind of overload people with information as soon as they enter the app, but at a well-timed position, do try and explain more. Then work package 5, Patrick, can you talk a bit more about that one?
Yeah, so the idea here is sort of referred to earlier as well, is that what we would like to do for the 4 work packages is try to make sure that we have continuous validation as we go along. And this can take the form of, or it can take many different forms, but really what you tend to do with things like wireframe explorations or simple prototypes is come up with fast and easy methods just for getting feedback on it. And we can do that online or in person. But the idea is that we make turnaround cycles really, really quick. So on the order of maybe days or hours of just trying something out and then seeing if it works for a small set of people. Some of the different types of ways you can do this include things that we call card sorts, where we might want to have people try and cluster a different terminology. For example, with work that's going on for some of the naming conventions that we wanted to experiment with. We can have people try and actually sort and cluster those things that we name in our content strategy, for example, if we want to do that. And tree tests, along with, again, doing more informal user studies. So grabbing someone just for a few minutes at a time, either through video conferencing, or maybe we will set up just a regular cycle of rolling studies where maybe once a week we'll have just a few people that will test out some ideas. So this is largely, I mean, as you can tell, it's largely TBD, but it's also a critical part of making sure that whatever we're testing out actually has some evidence-backed validation that's going on, and that we can point to decisions that were made in the past when people ask about it in the future.
Yeah, here also a plug to please participate in helping us set up these tests, but also in helping us test out some of these concepts that we will be developing. You can find us on Status itself in the UX Research public channel, but also you can write to uxr@status.im because we be looking for people to test out some of these the concepts that come out of both this work package, but basically all work packages that we would be validating over the coming period. Right. As I mentioned, next to the work packages, to limit our scope, we also looked at how can we focus our attention to specific users. Now, this is only a start of it. Conventionally, what we would use is the concept of personas, referring to these as user profiles because they are not as in-depth. They're more an indication that we can start from. So, for example, in the UK, we do know that, and actually across the board, for what we know so far, our audience is generally between 25 and 35 years old, is generally male. Differences between UK and Iran is that in UK, Coinbase is a very popular wallet application, while in Iran, my Ether wallet is more popular. And that might say something to us about what terminology people are already familiar with. Similarly, when it comes to chat, in the UK, WhatsApp is the most popular application, while in Iran, Telegram is most popular, in spite of it being banned recently. Also, platform, slight differences there, but not too big, with iOS being a bit more popular in the UK than in Iran. Also looking at what type of features might be more interesting than others, and this will help us create a more intuitive flow in directing people to certain features as soon as you come into the app. So for example, would you be more interested in making transactions or setting up a dApp for trading, for example, that would help us onboard users in a, let's say, more lengthy process, thinking beyond like initial onboarding screens, but in, let's say, the first week or first 2 weeks of experiencing the app, we could direct to that a little bit more. In Iran, similarly, wallet is seems to be most important, but there's a little bit more variance in that dApps and chat come very close. So that, yeah, that audience might make it challenging for us to figure out how to create hierarchy and how to create a layout that will help each of the features stand out best. All right, briefly going into the timeline here of what we're talking about, because obviously we do want to keep moving forward. We want to fix issues, but we don't want it to be an endless process. We're looking at around 3 months now, but more importantly here is to indicate that some of these work packages can easily run in parallel. But for example, work package 1 and 2 would serve as input for work package 3 and 4. Meaning that they would start slightly earlier than some of the explorations that would be done for work package 3 and 4. Also here, you can see that work package 5 on formative testing and validation runs with a certain cadence over the whole period. So roughly every 2 weeks, a user test, which indeed, as Patrick mentioned, could be something like a card sort, but it could also be testing out a new home screen interface, for example. All right, and then lastly, some information about how we intend to work. This is not finalized yet, and actually, to be more accurate, we envision that each work package would organically find their own way of working as long as we keep communication lines open, communication channels open between each work package. We would say that each work package works independently, but does share some common phases that they would go through, which is defining the actual problem. So when it comes to identity, what are the actual problems that we see there? When it comes to navigation, what are the actual problems that we see there? We obviously have insights there, but to start out with a well-defined problem will be helpful going forward. Determine the tools that work package feels are necessary, whether it's diagrams or wireframes or any other tools that might be interesting given the work to be done. Assigning roles. So at the moment we have some volunteers, sometimes not entirely voluntary, who we have noted down as contributors for each work package, but we do feel it's important that each work package has one single point of contact to communicate with others, and for each work package to agree on, let's say, week by week deliverables of, for example, the tools that are the output of the tools that are being used. So week 1 could be delivery of a diagram, week 2 could be delivery of wireframes, for example. That is something that we feel could happen within each work package. Between work packages, we would propose a bi-weekly sync that could just be, let's say, a conversational call. It could be a demo of the work that one of the work packages has finalized. And then lastly, a channel for each, a public channel for each work package on status. At the moment, there is one already created for work package 1 that we'll also share in the discuss post, so you know where to find it. Small graph there that basically shows the connection between the work packages. So work package 1, identity, work package 2, information architecture and content, will respectively influence starting a new chat with a new or existing contact, and home screen and navigation, while work package 5 will influence each of these work packages. That is what we have so far. Would love to hear your feedback, and would now also want to make sure that we didn't leave anything out. Patrick, do you feel there's something else that we would want to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know it's sort of like a lot of abstract talking, and it may feel like a lot of process. However, we do think this is really, really going to help with basically structuring a way of kind of going about kind of doing some system design moving forward, which I think as we get into it, it probably won't feel like as much work as maybe we're outlining right now. So yeah, I think we're also open to, of course, any comments or any suggestions on how to improve or how to maybe tweak things as we go along as well. And of course, if you want to join a work package, reach out to myself, Hester, or anyone else that's in the teams.
Yeah, and just also noting there, especially like coming from the community or working on, let's say, related projects, your input in helping define an information architecture and especially identity across Web3 applications is going to be really important. So if you're working on something else, but you feel there might be a connection, please do reach out. And again, we'll start a public channel for each of the work packages and share those in the discuss post. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm not sure what our next tech talk is going to be, so please stay tuned on Twitter and on our other known channels to follow up. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks.